Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala program in linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Professor of Linguistics at the Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We will look at the module on prosodic phonology dealing with the categories, the word and the phonological phrase, as promised in the previous module. Our objective is to introduce you, the students, to the phonological word and the phonological phrase, the motivations for positing them and the issues relating to their definition and their structure and function in prosodic phonology. To begin with, we have the phonological word. What is a phonological word? We define a phonological word as a category that consists of one or more feet, one of them being strong and the others, if any, being weak. Now, the phonological word depends heavily on the syntactic word, but is not coterminous with it, as maintained by the indirect mapping hypothesis discussed in the last module. Now, look at the figure that follows and see how the prosodic units are organized around it. The sentence is the same that we have looked at before. The new book is a useful resource. Look at its structure again, the metrical grid representation on the screen. What you notice here, when you look at the phonological phrase and the phonological word, what you notice here is the phonological phrase consists of two phonological phrases, consist of four phonological words. But a phonological word is also one which incorporates in it these other materials, particles, which are not stressed, but which go with it. For example, the new is a phonological word. A book is a bookser. That's how the native speakers of English pronounce. So this is a phonological word. It's not the same as syntactic word, because syntactic words will say the is one word, new is another, book is another, and so on. Whereas the phonological word essentially takes into account the main word and some of these words alongside it, which are pronounced together with the word. Now, do we need for the phonological word for stating rules? Yes, we do. We want to take a look at an example from Hindi. Now, Hindi has two varieties that are considered to be standard varieties. One is called standard formal Hindi. That's less common. It's a very Sanskritized variety of Hindi. And the other is standard colloquial Hindi. That's the one which is most common and used by the educated speakers of Hindi. Now, when we compare these two varieties, there is a certain phenomenon that seems to distinguish them. Look at the examples to see what this phenomenon is. As you see on the screen, the SCH, that is standard colloquial Hindi, has in it words with long vowels on the screen. So we have apitu, ati, tithi, shatru, compared to standard formal Hindi, where we have all these vowels which end as long vowels in colloquial Hindi are short in formal Hindi, such as apitu, ati, tithi, shatru. Now, how do we account for this rule? We say that a short vowel becomes a long vowel. When does it become a long vowel? At the end of a word. So it is the word which now must be included as a part of the statement of the phonological rule of vowel lengthening in standard colloquial Hindi. We cannot simply say a vowel is lengthened. We have to say where it is within a word in its word final position. Now, as a rule domain, and this is an important area for us to see how how prosodic phonology as a theory actually is needed in phonological theory. This is as a rule domain. Now, the basic argument of rule domain as we go along above the word is that at the word and above the word level is to see that certain processes must be restricted to apply within words, or they must be restricted to apply within phrases, or they may be allowed to apply in the intonational phrase as a whole. Now we have a phenomenon from Hindi again to see how the phonological word can function as a rule domain. There is a process of flapping in Hindi with examples on the screen. So Hindi has the phones d and r as allophones. Now, where does r occur? R occurs like the la velarization rule, like the velar la, at the end of words, as in paired, or between two vowels, as in ghoda. Now, these two are good examples. The others illustrate them. So we have modana, jodana, danda, and dak. As you see, da doesn't appear between two vowels at the end of words. So in all other contexts, it is da. Now, the rule for flapping rule, as we state, is that a da becomes a ra between a vowel and another vowel or at the end of words. We know that we can simply state it as at the end of a syllable. So the rule must be stated as da becomes ra between two vowels or at the end of words. We do not want to go into the issue of relating these two environments. They require further discussion in genitive phonology. All that we have to be rest contented is that both of them can be assumed to have one particular representation. For now, all we know is that the rule must be restricted to apply within words and not across words. Thus, as a result of word formation, if da occurs between two vowels, that is a word ending in a vowel and a word following beginning with a vowel, so that you have, let's say, a vowel a and another vowel a, in between, if da occurs, then it doesn't become ra. For example, we have examples here like danda, but when we have a phrase such as uska danda, it doesn't become uskaranda. So ra becoming da becoming ra between two vowels must be restricted to apply within the phonological word and not across it. So the word must be seen to be the domain. Now the word as a phonological category is not included in the statement of the rule, as you can see that the rule as it is stated. But it must be specified, the rule must be specified to apply within a word. And that's the domain restriction of the rule. Phonotactics is well known for most languages. When we talk about phonotactics, then we talk about what can occur at the beginning of words, what can occur at the end of words. We have, for example, just for example, we have these phonotactic constraints in bhumij, for example. So things like aspirated plosives do not occur word finally, it's negative, and then they must occur either word initially or word medially. And then the consonants, a glottal stop, ra and a nga, do not occur word initially. So these are the constraints on the phonotactics of the sounds in this language called bhumij. Coming to prominence relation, it is quite obvious, we have already discussed this, that in the phonological word, we do have prominence relation between feet. One of them is strong, is prominent, the others are weak, that is not prominent. So Basically, essentially, the motivation of prominence relations came from the discussion of word stress, which it was shown in metrical phonology that the stress is explained as consisting of feet, one of them being the strongest one. Now the phonological phrase. What is a phonological phrase? It's a domain of application of phonological rules and of the prominence relations above the word. So this is what defines a phonological phrase. It's also the unit in which accentuation takes place, one of which emerges as the nucleus of the intonational unit. So the new book is a useful resource. Now, the source is also accented, but that's the one which bears the nucleus, the last accented syllable in this production. Now, phonological phrase, as we said earlier, that under the indirect mapping hypothesis, which is the one which is most commonly assumed in prosodic phonology, that the phonological phrase and the syntactic phrase are not coterminous. The phonological phrases give us a good example, good instantiation of the theory of indirect hypothesis. Let's look at the examples on the screen. So syntactic phrase, we have John is a teacher. Phonological phrase, you can have John's a teacher. That's the most normal structure of the pronunciation. Then syntactic phrase, Ramesh, noun phrase, was, verb phrase, a topper, a noun phrase again, in his class. This is the prepositional phrase. So 4 syntactic phrases. As compared to them, we have the phrase phonological phrases, either 3 or 2. So we say Ramesh was a topper in his class, or Ramesh was a topper in his class. We can say, produce them like this. How to define a phonological phrase? There has been a considerable amount of discussion and amounting to controversies as to how phonological phrases should be defined, because they are not apparent. You have syllable which is very finely defined. There's hardly any difference of opinion about what the syllable structure of a word is, and similarly the word. But when it comes to phonological phrase, then there are differences of opinion. We have basically 3 theories known as the end-based theory, the relation-based theory, and alignment theory. Alignment theory and end-based theory are related, and actually they have come from the same proposal. What the theory says, end-based theory and alignment theory says, is that syntactic phrase and the phonological phrase must be aligned at one of the edges, either the right-hand side of the phrase or the left-hand side of the phrase. That's the relation between syntax and syntactic structure phrase and phonological structure. So the relation-based theory makes use of 3 principles of phonological phrase formation. These include the phrase domain, phonological phrase construction, and phonological phrase relative prominence. These are defined. These are shown on the screen. Take a look at them closely. The domain of phonological phrase is defined as follows. We have introduced here the category C, which stands for a clitic group, which is higher than a word, and all it says is that a domain of a phrase consists of a clitic which contains a lexical head and all clitics on its non-recurrent side up to the C clitic that contains another head outside of the maximal projection of X. You have to be able to see here as syntactic structure of sentences and phrases which are of 2 types. One is that so the other approach to the definition of phonological phrase is known as the relation-based theory proposed by Nesper and Vogel. In this approach, we have 3 different principles of phonological phrase formation, known as phrase domain, phrase construction, and relative prominence. You read the module and see how these 3 principles work in forming a phonological phrase. Essentially, the main criteria for phrase formation that are discussed here deal with the structure of a phrase or even of a sentence in terms of either being left dominant or right dominant. And if it is right dominant, then you have to see that how far on the left it can go, the phonological phrase can go, and so on. So all these factors are taken into account in defining phonological phrase. Once a phonological phrase has been defined and marked, what we notice is, and this is one of the interesting phenomena observed in the relation-based theory, is that sometimes a phrase, a phonological phrase which must be seen as a phonological phrase, comes to lose its status. Or, put in other words, a phonological phrase which is a phonological phrase adjacent to another phrase comes to extend its status, so that essentially, in effect, two phonological phrases become one. The process is shown on the screen as this. So a clitic group, which is part of a phonological phrase, another clitic group, which is another phrase, they are two clitics groups, but within the same phonological phrase. So essentially, it says two adjacent phonological phrases are organized into one, and this process is known as restructuring. Restructuring is common among many languages. For example, in a language such as Hindi, when I produce a sentence such as मालिनी ने एक नया घर खरीदा, मालिनी ने एक नया घर खरीदा, Malini bought a new house. Now, normally the phonological phrases are Malini ne ek naya ghar kharida. Three phonological phrases in this kind of slow production. But we often hear speakers say something like Malini ne ek naya ghar kharida. Malini ne ek naya ghar kharida. When I say Malini ne ek naya ghar kharida, kharida has lost its phonological phrase status and is subsumed within the preceding, within the adjacent, the left phonological phrase. We have a representation of this from Italian as shown by Nesper and Vogel, and you see them on the screen here. So, pescera granchi, he will fish crabs. So, we have two clitic groups, two phrases. Now, they become a single phrase, as you see on the screen. Phonological phrase as a domain of phonological rule application. We have an example from Assamese to illustrate this point. Assamese of a certain variety known as Nolboria's variety of Assamese. In Nolboria Assamese, there is a process called assimilation. Ra is found to assimilate to a following coronal consonant within a phonological word. Such if you have dordam, it is doddam. Dorza is dozza. Korsi is kosi. It's a common phonological process also found to be present in Bangla and some other varieties of Bangla and Assamese. The point about this, this rule is that the ra assimilation, which must be stated as ra assimilation, we simply say ra assimilates to a following coronal consonant. But in order to predict the correct outcome, correct result, we find that it has to apply not only within the word, but must be allowed to apply even across words, provided they occur within a phonological phrase. So we have a sentence given here from Assamese such as Romene, Ramor, Soiltu, Namtu, Zane. Romene, Ramor, Soiltu, Namtu, Zane. Now, In fast speech, what we find is that the R assimilation takes place so that it is Ramor soil 2 becomes Ramos soil 2. Now these are two different words, Ramor and soil 2, but the R assimilation does take place within this. But it doesn't take place when R occurs at the end of a phonological phrase, as you notice for the following word. When you say soil tur and nam, it doesn't become soil tunnam. There could be some other possible reasons for the R assimilation not applying here, but at least as we see it represented, the sentence represented on the screen, the rule doesn't apply there. So we have come to the end of the discussion of the phonological word and the phonological phrase as categories of the phonological theory called prosodic phonology. As you will notice, it's a very interesting theory, very insightful theory that can help explain not only prosodic phenomena such as stress and accentuation and intonation, but also several segmental phenomena which are not confined to apply within the word, but which can have restrictions outside the word. Thank you.